Ethan Miller and Rachel Stone thought their million-dollar dream homes were built to last, until the HOA poured concrete into the creek that protected their land. What happened next turned their neighborhood into a swamp, wrecked property values, and exposed a trail of corruption buried in county records. This isn't just a story about flooding, it's a warning about how one reckless HOA decision can destroy an entire community. Watch until the end to see how greed, bad planning, and nature's revenge brought this upscale neighborhood to its knees, and why it could happen to you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so more homeowners can protect themselves from HOA abuse before it's too late. The neighborhood had been built on land that, for decades, lived in quiet balance with a narrow creek winding through its center. It wasn't the kind of waterway that drew tourists or inspired grand paintings, but it had a steady rhythm that shaped the land around it. In spring, its banks were lined with green shoots of grass and willow roots that dipped into the water. In summer, the water thinned to a slow trickle, leaving polished stones exposed to the sun. When autumn rains came, the creek swelled just enough to carry away leaves and keep the soil moist. In winter, thin layers of ice formed in delicate patterns over the shallow bends. It had always been there, doing its work without drawing attention, keeping the neighborhood dry even in the heaviest storms. When the new HOA board took over, they didn't see the creek as a blessing. To them, it was an untidy, unpredictable element in a place that was supposed to look perfectly planned. They saw erosion as an eyesore, fallen branches as a maintenance headache, and the sound of rushing water as a nuisance to the picture of suburban quiet they were trying to sell. What they envisioned was a manicured strip of grass and ornamental shrubs, the kind you'd see in glossy real estate brochures. In their minds, the creek was in the way. Their decision was quick and absolute. Contractors were hired without much notice to residents. On an overcast morning, a line of concrete mixers rolled into the greenbelt, their tires leaving deep ruts in the soft ground. The smell of wet cement spread through the air as workers in hard hats positioned metal frames across the creek's bends. Without ceremony, gray slurry began to pour into the flowing water. The current, at first quick and defiant, slowed under the heavy weight, pooling in strange places before disappearing entirely. The gurgle of water was replaced by the low grind of trowels smoothing over the new surface. By the time the trucks left, the water's path was sealed under a flat, unbroken sheet of concrete. The willows still stood for now, their roots trapped beneath the new barrier, their leaves trembling in a wind that no longer carried the cool scent of moving water. Where fish and frogs had once darted between reeds, there was nothing but a pale gray expanse reflecting the dull sky. The HOA presented the change as a beautification project, claiming it would create a safer and more attractive space for the community. They spoke of lower maintenance costs and a tidier appearance. Some residents nodded along, trusting the board's vision, while others stood at their windows in silence, watching a part of the landscape disappear forever. Nobody openly questioned whether the creek had been serving a purpose beyond looks. Nobody considered that it might have been protecting their homes in ways no landscaping crew could. It was gone now, and the ground held its silence, waiting for the day when the absence would be felt in ways no one could ignore. In the weeks after the creek was buried under concrete, the neighborhood looked exactly as the HOA had promised. The green belt stretched in a smooth, uniform line, flanked by trimmed shrubs and freshly rolled sod. The concrete channel was framed by ornamental stones, giving it the appearance of a modern walkway rather than the remains of a living waterway. Residents who had once thought the project unnecessary found themselves admitting it looked clean and orderly. To casual visitors, it appeared as though the HOA had improved the land. But nature was already beginning its quiet work, testing the changes. The first signs came after a gentle summer storm. Rainwater, which for decades had slipped easily into the creek and flowed out of the neighborhood, now had nowhere to go. The concrete surface allowed a shallow stream to run for a short while, but its straight, unnatural shape left little room for absorption. Instead, the water spread out at the edges, seeping into the soil in small, stubborn puddles. They weren't large enough to raise concern at first, just dark circles on lawns and soft patches underfoot. The HOA dismissed them as seasonal moisture, confident they would dry quickly. But they didn't dry as quickly as expected. The water lingered, saturating the ground in ways it hadn't before. Homeowners began noticing the grass growing unevenly, with certain spots turning yellow or developing moldy patches. Shrubs planted along the greenbelt started to wither, their roots sitting in waterlogged soil. The willows that had once lined the creek lost their color and dropped leaves early, their deep roots struggling in the absence of moving water. By late summer, subtle but troubling changes began to appear beneath the neighborhood's most expensive homes. Soil that had always been compact and stable now shifted ever so slightly, leaving tiny depressions in gardens and uneven spots in driveways. In a few yards, bricks in decorative walls tilted, and patios showed hairline cracks. These signs were easy to ignore individually, but together they painted a clear picture. The land was adjusting to the loss of its natural drainage system. The HOA offered no explanations. They focused instead on smaller maintenance issues, patching lawns and planting replacement shrubs in the greenbelt. Contractors came and went, adding layers of mulch over damp soil as though covering the problem could make it disappear. The idea that the concrete project might be the cause was never mentioned at community meetings. Privately, a few residents began to worry. They remembered how the creek had once swelled during heavy rains and carried excess water away, keeping the ground dry even in storms. Now, without it, there was no release, only slow absorption into soil that could take no more. Each rainfall seemed to bring a little more pooling, a little more instability. Though the houses still stood tall, and the lawns still looked neat from a distance, the first quiet warnings had already arrived. The ground beneath the neighborhood was changing, and no one knew just how deep the damage would go. The first heavy storm of winter came without much warning. Dark clouds rolled over the horizon, carried by sharp winds that rattled windows and sent dry leaves swirling through the streets. Within hours, the rain began, steady at first, then pounding against rooftops with a force that made the gutters groan. For most neighborhoods, this would have been nothing more than an inconvenience. But in a place where the natural creek had been sealed away under concrete, the storm became something far more dangerous. Water rushed into the greenbelt, funneled by streets and driveways that had been designed to send runoff toward what was once a living drainage system. Instead of disappearing into a winding bed of soil and roots, it slammed into the flat, rigid surface of the concrete channel. At first, it flowed along in a shallow stream, but the straight design left nowhere for the excess to slow and settle. The water reached the far end of the greenbelt, met a slight dip in the concrete, and began to collect. Within minutes, the channel overflowed, sending water surging sideways into backyards. The soil, already weakened by months of slow saturation, had no strength to absorb the sudden volume. Grass submerged instantly, turning bright green lawns into murky pools. Small decorative garden beds disappeared entirely beneath churning brown water. Homeowners, peering through rain-streaked windows, watched their yards vanish into a swelling flood. Those with basements heard the dull thump of some pumps engaging, but many soon discovered the pumps were no match for the sheer volume pouring in. As the hours passed, the water level rose higher. It crept into garages, soaking stored boxes and tools, then seeped through the seams of back doors. Street drains, clogged with leaves and debris from the storm, failed completely, turning intersections into shallow lakes. The greenbelt, once the neighborhood's pride, transformed into an unbroken sheet of water that reflected the gray sky like a mirror. Emergency crews tried to respond, but their focus was on areas with known flood risks. On paper, this community wasn't one of them. No one had reported the loss of the creek as an environmental concern, so no precautions had been in place. By nightfall, the water reached knee-height in some yards, forcing residents to wade through the cold flood just to reach their cars. Inside, furniture was lifted onto tables in a last-minute effort to save it, while carpets and hardwood floors soaked through beyond repair. By morning, news crews had arrived. Helicopter shots showed rows of expensive homes marooned in a wide, unnatural lake. Reporters spoke about unprecedented flooding without knowing the decisions that had caused it. Insurance adjusters began their work, already asking for maintenance records and drainage plans. The HOA gathered in a closed meeting, trying to find a way to frame the disaster as an act of nature. But the water that still lingered in every yard told a different story, one that no amount of explanation could wash away. When the storm finally passed and the floodwaters began to recede, the neighborhood looked nothing like the picture-perfect community advertised in brochures. Lawns were coated in a thin layer of silt, flower beds were crushed under debris, and the air carried the sharp smell of mold beginning to take hold. Cleanup crews arrived with pumps and industrial vacuums, working to remove the standing water that had pooled in garages and basements. Residents moved in a slow daze, dragging waterlogged furniture to the curb and peeling back warped floorboards. While most people focused on the physical mess, one homeowner quietly decided to investigate how it had all happened. A trip to the county records office revealed a paper trail the HOA had never shared. Permits for the Greenbelt Improvement Project were filed months before the concrete work began, accompanied by technical reports from engineers and environmental consultants. Buried within those reports were warnings, clear, detailed, and impossible to misinterpret. The creek, they said, was not just a natural feature but an essential drainage artery for the area. Removing it would drastically increase the risk of flooding, weaken the soil structure, and create long-term instability for surrounding foundations. One report even included flood simulation maps that looked eerily similar to what the neighborhood had just endured. The permits also showed another troubling detail. The HOA had bypassed certain environmental reviews, applying instead for a fast-track approval process meant for minor landscaping work. In doing so, they avoided more extensive inspections and saved thousands of dollars in fees. What seemed at first like simple negligence began to look like deliberate avoidance. Further digging uncovered something even more startling. The landscaping company hired for the project was owned by a close relative of the HOA president. Financial statements revealed inflated invoices for materials and labor, suggesting that the board had approved payments well beyond market rates. It became clear that the Greenbelt's transformation was not just a misguided aesthetic choice. It had also been an opportunity for personal profit. Back in the neighborhood, small groups of residents began sharing their own pieces of the puzzle. A few recalled attending early HOA meetings where concerns about water flow had been brushed aside. Others remembered seeing surveyors briefly inspecting the creek months before the project started, only to vanish without explanation. The picture forming was one of calculated risk, where warnings were ignored and voices silenced in favor of quick results and financial gain. By the time these findings began circulating, frustration had hardened into quiet outrage. The damage was no longer just about ruined lawns or soggy basements. It was about trust, the kind residents had placed in the very people meant to protect the community's interests. The storm had exposed more than poor planning. It had pulled back the curtain on a decision-making process built on self-interest. And as the neighborhood dried out under a pale winter sun, a deeper question began to take root. If this had been hidden from them, what else was buried in the HOA's files? As winter turned to spring, the neighborhood began to realize that the flood had not been a one-time disaster. Even without heavy storms, the ground stayed wet long after rainfall, and puddles appeared in places where grass had once grown thick and healthy. The concrete laid over the creek had not stopped the water's natural course. It had simply forced it to spread sideways, pooling in every low-lying space it could find. What had once been firm, stable soil was now soft underfoot, sinking slightly when stepped on. Lawns squished like sponges, and no amount of aerating or reseeding could restore them. The changes brought unwelcome guests. Cattails began sprouting along property lines where water refused to drain. Mosquitoes multiplied in the stagnant pools, their buzzing a constant annoyance during the warmer months. Frogs took up residence in ornamental ponds and flooded flower beds, their nighttime calls echoing through the neighborhood. What the HOA had once promised as a perfectly manicured greenbelt now resembled the edge of a wetland. Home values plummeted as word spread about the flooding issues. Potential buyers, seeing the standing water and hearing stories from residents, quickly lost interest. Real estate listings lingered for months without offers, and when sales did happen, they came at steep losses. For many, the dream of living in $1 million home had turned into a nightmare of repairs, insurance battles, and constant maintenance just to keep mold at bay. The HOA, already fractured by internal disputes, dissolved under the weight of lawsuits and investigations. With no formal leadership, Maintenance of the greenbelt stopped entirely. The ornamental shrubs died, the sod browned and peeled away, and cracks began to form in the once pristine concrete surface. In some areas, nature started to reclaim what had been taken from it. Thin streams of water forced their way through small fractures, carrying bits of soil and grass seeds that sprouted in the cracks. Over time, these breaks widened, creating narrow channels where water once again began to flow. The residents who stayed learned to adapt in small ways. Some embraced the transformation, planting water-loving vegetation and turning their backyards into rain gardens. Others built small footbridges over the swampy ground to reach sheds or side gates. Yet the changes came with a sense of loss that couldn't be repaired. The sound of rushing water from the old creek was gone, replaced by the heavy silence of standing pools. The land's rhythm had been interrupted, and no one knew if it could ever fully return. By the second anniversary of the flood, the greenbelt was no longer a selling point, it was a warning sign. From above, drone footage showed an irregular patchwork of wetlands where once there had been a smooth ribbon of lawn. The concrete, cracked and sunken in places, looked like a scar across the landscape. And beneath it all, the ghost of the creek still moved, slow and persistent, carving its way back through the obstacles humans had built, as if reminding everyone that water always finds its way home.